So a few months ago, I had a discussion internally with my team about composables. We came into a situation where we basically had many composables in our project, and all of them were basically different, were developed in a different way. So at a certain point, we decided that it's now the point that we need to create something we called composables contract, basically a checklist that will allow us to build new composables based on this agreed structure, so that each new composable will be basically the same, so that we won't have discussions on whether we should implement it in that way or the other way. And because of the fact that this kind of knowledge is quite generic, quite agnostic, I would say, it's not only working for my project, it can work for any other project built with Vue.js, I decided to select this as the topic for my presentation, which is basically about good practices and design patterns for Vue composables. So my name is Jakub, and I'm a full-stack developer. I'm part of Next team, Next ecosystem team of the modules. I talked about it a little bit earlier. I'm also a Google developer expert in web performance, and I'm also ambassador for Storyblock, Algolia, Cloudinary, and Supabase. So if you're interested in talking about any of these things, after the talk, I'm open for discussions. And I'm also very happy to be here with you today. I remember 2 years ago when we had the same Vue.js DE conference in Berlin. I remember I had so great experience there that I said to myself, if there will be a new edition of Vue.js DE, I will do my best to be here with you again. And here I am. So from this point, I would like to say a huge thank you to the organizers, and also if we can get a huge round of applause for them for organizing this amazing event. So, going to the topic. Raise your hand if you use composables in your project. OK, I think half, maybe 60% of the group, of the audience. So that will be good for the next thing. In me explaining what is a composable. So as Vue.js documentation states, composable is a function that leverages Vue Composition API to encapsulate and reuse stateful logic. And we can have an example of that. I'm not sure if the left one is visible, but the next one will be bigger, I promise. So in general, composables are functions that use composition API utilities like refs, like a certain component, certain lifecycle hooks, and all the goodies from Vue world in the form of a reusable function. So in this case, we have useMouse, and inside we have two ref variables, x and y, that then can be updated to match the x and y positions of the mouse. Pretty straightforward. In the end, we return those reactive values. This composable function can then be imported in a Vue component very easily, and we can use it in the template, just outputting the x and y values directly to the template. We can also have async examples, like fetching data, where on the left side we have two properties, two variables, data and error. Probably we could have one more for loading or pending to indicate whether the request is still ongoing. And we have a fetch, a watch effect, and inside we have a fetch, where it uses the two-value helper. I will be talking about it a little later. But just in a short description, two-value unwraps the ref or a getter that can be passed as a parameter. Then, if the response is successful, we just populate the data object, data value. And if there is an error, we just populate the error. And we can use it the same way. With composables, we can use them also for options API, which until a certain point I wasn't aware of. is that you can basically call them in the setup function, return it, specifically return the reactive values, so x, y, data, and error from previous examples. And in the mounted hook, we can use these variables as by using the keyword this.x, this.y. And composables were developed and designed to solve a certain problem. Raise your hand if you use mixins in Vue 2 or still using until today. OK, not a lot. So in Vue 2, we had mixins. And mixins were solving quite similar problem, but in a different way. So we wanted to have the reusability of code that that certain functions can be used in many different places so that we don't repeat the code. But the problem of mixins, the mixins had three main problems: namespace collisions, implicit cross-mixin communication, and unclear source of properties. And it is all related to the fact that we weren't exactly sure what properties is this mixin returning or implementing, adding to our code. What is the relation between one mixin and another? And the fact that some mixins can have basically the same names, or the properties in the mixins can have the same names. So composables are meant to solve this problem by implementing the reusability functions in a different way. And I wanted to talk about these good practices of building the composables so that they are more maintainable, readable, and easier to develop. So starting with naming. Vue documentation says that all composables should start with the keyword use, like use fetch, use mouse, use intersection observer. But I would add to it that it is also useful to name the file the same way as the composable. Why? We might also name it with the folder name and the index.js or TS file. But then you will run into a situation that I had in my project, where we had thousands of index.ts file. So searching through them in your IDE was a pain. And having 10 index.ts files open at the same time was also a pain. Small quality of life improvement. Input arguments. I mentioned that we can pass some arguments to composables. And I mentioned also that we can pass refs or getters. So in order to process this kind of reactive values, we can use the helper toValue that will convert the ref or a getter into a static, like primitive type string, a number, things like that. If there will be a already primitive passed, this utility function will just return it. It won't do anything. Return values. So useMouse returned x and y. Data useFetch was returning data error, possibly loading. So there is a rule that each composable should return a ref value that can be accessed after destructuring it. Question why ref and not reactive? Because reactive will lose the reactivity to the original state object. That's why we are using refs. Global state. Composables can have some sort, I would say, global state if we define the ref outside of the composable function. So we can have a variable called global value, which is registered above the use global value composable. And then we can have a function that will update the global value and we return both global value and set global value function. This works, but if you really need global state management, I suppose, or I would recommend you to use tools that were designed for that, either Pinia or Vuex. Composables can have side effects. In a previous example of useMouse, you could see that we are adding event listeners for mouse move, and we are updating x and y accordingly. So what we should do after we add such side effects, we should remove them, like get rid of them. And you will be surprised how many pages I audited that were adding event listeners but not removing them. This happens quite a lot. So. Usage restrictions. Composables should be called within script setup or the setup hook. But in some cases, we can also call them in lifecycle hooks, like onMounted. Composables can be nested if one composable is growing inside. The size of it is growing, like the complexity is increasing of the code that is inside the composable. We can extract certain code into different composables and then use it accordingly. In this particular case, we have use event listener composable that is handling basically the onMounted and unmounted functionality from this code block. And it is nested inside the use mouse composable. And finally, abstraction. Composable should abstract certain logic inside. What we should do when the logic becomes too complex? Extract composable into separate ones. And one here, I forgot to mention, the recommendation for nesting composables actually comes from the very basics and the naming event convention of Composition API, because Composition API was actually named so that we can similarly the components, where components application is composed from smaller components to build a big website, to have a similar experience with those reusable functions, so we can compose functions, so composables and Composition API. Some further notes regarding the good practices. The one I showed you a second ago, they were based mainly on Vue good practices. But I also have few additional notes that are based on my experience and working with different projects and different developers. So stateful versus stateless. The definition says that the composables are meant to work with stateful logic. So it should contain some reactive values, like an x and y, or data or error. But in some cases, you might end up in a project where not all composables are stateful. Maybe some developers like to use the composables as some sort of helpers, where they don't store any state. So the function, the composable, is just a simple input-output function. It gets an input and returns an output. It doesn't store any state. So my recommendation here would be to add to this contract, like composables contract, how we write composables. Whether we go fully with what Vue.js good practices recommend, so only have stateful logic, or do we support stateless as well, or do we support both? Like, do we support one or second, first or the second one, or both? Because if we have this written down, we will avoid situations such as I had in my project, where basically we were having discussions on whether we should have stateful or stateless. So example shown as before, in this case, use user, where we are basically fetching information about the user and storing it in a data variable. And in the other case, in the second code block, we see an example of stateless composable. You will probably see both, but the recommended one is the one on the left side with the state. Testing. We got a lot about testing in the previous talk by Lara, so I won't be touching that much about it. But in general, composables are JavaScript or TypeScript functions, so we can easily test them using tools such as vtest. And thanks to the fact that we are having this logic inside of composables and not components, we can test just the business logic without having an issue of trying to test the framework itself. Believe me, framework itself was tested already a few times. So regular testing, very simple example about the counter. We have count that will be increased if we trigger a method increment. And then in our test file, we are calling the composable initially the value of count is 0. If we increment it, the value is 1. Very simple to test and to maintain. It's getting a bit more difficult if our component uses lifecycle hooks or provide inject. In this case, we would need to create a utility function, as in this example with setup, that will accept composable as a parameter. And then it will create something what is called a wrapped. It will wrap the composable in a host component that will basically, in a setup function, it will run the composable, and it will return a result and the mounted app. So then in our test case, what we could do is we could just run with setup and the composable as a passed parameter, have access to both result and app, and then we can test how it behaves while using the provide, inject, and even unmount. The scope. I said about it already that the problem with the scope, or the increasing scope of the composables, is quite frequent, I would say. Because if we create a composable which maps certain domain or certain entity, we might think that it's good for now. But with the development of the project, we might end up in a situation where the composable will grow so much that it's no longer maintainable. So in this case, it might be easier and better to extract some of the logic from the base composable into separate composables. So let's take a look at these examples. So the example above is an actual example of what I was maintaining some time ago. It was a composable about cart in e-commerce. So cart might not seem that difficult, but if you think that in cart we have the actual cart, the object that contains all the products, we can load or fetch this cart, we can add an item, we can remove items, we can remove the whole cart. So the scope of this composable can grow by a mile. So that's why I figured out that at a certain point, it might be better to just create smaller composables, where each of them will represent different functionality of the cart. So we have use add to cart, use fetch cart, or use remove possibly item from cart. Document, and by document I mean documentation. With the development of the project, you will end up with many composables probably. Probably some composables won't be treated like a reusable functions, but they will be used as a regular function that we want to extract some logic from the component, which is not, let's say, reusable, but it is there because we don't want to overpopulate the component with some business logic. So to solve the problem of having too many composables and not knowing which ones to use, it's very useful to have documentation, like VidPress, for example, for documenting your components. In one of the talks, there was a mention about Storybook, which I also recommend to check for documenting both components and composables. But even inline JS doc could make it work. Obviously, I think everyone's seen JS doc already, but I'm not sure how many of you know, but we can also use JS doc for documenting component props. I recently realized that, and it's quite useful. I said that I'm part of the Nux ecosystem team, which means that I'm maintaining few modules. Modules such as security, Cloudinary, Algolia, or Medusa. Each of them works in a different way. Obviously, the security module is about making your app more secure, while in case for Algolia, Cloudinary, and Medusa, these are the integration modules that allows you to more easily interact and connect with these third-party services. So Algolia, obviously search engine, Cloudinary, high performance and optimized images, and Medusa, open source e-commerce platform. So if we look at some of the examples of the composables that are part of these modules, we can see, for example, from the top that Medusa has a use Medusa client composable that returns a client. And this client can be then used to list all the products that we have in our Medusa e-commerce platform. Looks simple, like 2 lines of code, and we have fetched the products. Similar with the Algolia, we have used Algolia search composable. As a parameter, we can pass the index that we want to search through. And we have access to both result, which is like a reactive value of the search result, and the search method that we can trigger anytime, whether it's on the lifecycle hook or it's on the pressing the button, pressing the enter after in the input. And we are passing the query, in this case, Samsung. And finally, Cloudinary, where we can use CLD image URL composable. We can pass some options like optimization options, transformation options for the images. And we get as a response, we get URL that we can directly use in the image tag. My honest opinion on the best place with Vue Composables is actually, I think I mentioned it, and it was mentioned by the other speakers, is Vue use. I highly recommend to use it in your Vue project. It comes with very many useful utilities. Some of them I'm using on a daily basis, some of them not as frequently, but still they are very, very useful for handling several browser functionality for us. Example, use intersection observer. I use it quite a lot, and the thing that just blew my mind, on-click on the outside is like a really real lifesaver. Like 2 lines of code, and we can have this feature. Into conclusion, there is no single best approach to write Vue Composables. I showed you there different examples. We can have stateful and stateless. We can have composables that are not following the Vue patterns and good practices. So there is actually no single best approach. There are some recommendations, but you will see different composables. But these patterns and practices help me write more maintainable and efficient composables. And I hope that they will help you too. Coming back to this, if you think or know that there are some practices that work best for you, and you would like to share it, make sure to let me know. Because I have an article about the same topic as I have to the presentation today, where I'm trying to gather all the best practices and design patterns for Vue Composables. So if you know that there is something that works great for you, make sure to drop me a comment there. Let's make this like the best checklist for good practices for Vue Composables. As I said, let's stay in touch. If you'd like to talk to me about any of these topics I mentioned today, I have a YouTube channel, Jakub Andrzejewski, same for the Dev2 blog, where I'm posting weekly, and in Twitter or X. There is a small difference in GitHub. I'm not Jakub Andrzejewski, I'm Porosian, and in LinkedIn, I'm just the same as my Polish name, Jakub Andrzejewski. Thank you very much for having me, and I wish you a great rest of the conference.